Even today, if you pass by the ancient mist-covered doors of Blackwood Hall, you'll feel it, the eerie silence that seems to whisper, "There's something hidden here." A place where secrets lie buried, and everyone, whether a mistress or a servant, lives in the fear that if the truth comes out, everything will come crashing down. One room holds it all, the silent burden, the unspoken guilt, and with Miss Marple's sharp mind, she walks through this web of lies, where every little detail could be a hidden clue. Are you ready to embark on this chilling journey, where every secret uncovers a new misconception? Then let's begin this hunt. The carriage wheels grated over the loose gravel like bones crunching beneath soft earth, each rotation echoing louder in the thick, unmoving morning air as the vehicle curved steadily toward Wrenwood Manor, a place that seemed less like a home, and more like a secret that had been buried but not quite dead. Miss Agatha Whitlock sat upright inside, her posture as composed as the lace gloves that enclosed her folded hands, yet her eyes, clear and calculating, remained fixed on the ghostly shapes beyond the window. A pale fog curled along the ground like fingers reaching from some unseen past, swallowing trees, statues, and forgotten benches in its slow, patient crawl. The mansion did not emerge so much as it revealed itself unwillingly, first the iron weather vane, rusted and spinning with no wind, then the chipped stone pillars, blackened by years of rain and neglect, and finally the full facade of Wrenwood itself, towering once majestic, now hollow-eyed and weary, as though it had witnessed things too terrible to retell. Ivy choked the outer walls like veins of some parasitic force, the windows stared back dull and lifeless, and a long dead rose garden slumped in silence under tangled weeds. Agatha had heard whispers in market stalls and behind teacups, rumors of the Hawthorners' fading legacy, of locked rooms, unpaid debts, whispered arguments at odd hours, and servants who left abruptly without goodbyes. But what she felt now, gazing at the manor in its decaying glory, was not just curiosity, it was the sharp edge of something more visceral, as though the house itself resented being disturbed. The carriage came to a halt with a final jolt that made the mist scatter like startled birds, and the door creaked open to reveal Lady Eleanor Hawthorne standing just beyond the threshold, framed in the dim archway, like a portrait that had been repainted too many times. She wore elegance like armor, pearls around her throat, satin trailing at her heels, but her face was pale beneath its rouge, and her smile stretched just a moment too long. "Agatha, my dear," she said with a voice that tried to sound warm but cracked slightly at the edges, "you haven't changed a bit." But Agatha saw the signs instantly, how Eleanor's once proud frame now leaned imperceptibly on the doorframe for balance, how her eyes kept flitting upward toward the second-floor landing, as though waiting for our dreading an arrival. Inside, the house exhaled the stale breath of closed rooms and old regrets. The grand foyer, once polished marble and golden chandeliers, now bore the weight of years, portraits hung askew like disapproving ancestors, the scent of lavender polish long replaced by the faint must of rot and secrets. Eleanor led her to the drawing-room where the fireplace offered no fire, and conversation was laced with effort, each sentence sewn together with threads of careful omission. Then, as if summoned not by bell but by the house itself, came Mr. Gratham, the butler. He moved without sound, his arrival so seamless it was almost unnatural. His suit was immaculate, his hair combed with military precision, but his eyes, those betrayed him. As he poured the tea with ritual precision, Agatha noticed the tremor in his fingers, not clumsy, just controlled enough to show he had practiced hiding it. "Welcome back to Wrenwood, Miss Whitlock," he said in a voice so even it was almost a whisper, yet Agatha sensed it wasn't calm, it was containment. His eyes, cautious and quick, avoided hers but flicked toward Victor, Lady Eleanor's nephew, who lounged near the window with an almost defiant slouch, pretending to read a book that hadn't been turned in pages. There was something deeply wrong between them. Agatha could feel it, not just resentment, but a quiet war of unspoken truths. It was in the way Victor watched Gratham leave the room, in the stiffness of the butler's shoulders as he passed. This was no ordinary tension, it was the kind of pressure that builds slowly behind closed doors, where secrets rub against each other like stones until sparks start to bleed. Later, as Eleanor excused herself with a brittle smile to tend to some invented task, Agatha wandered through the house with silent steps, her instincts leading her to the pantry, tidy, exact, sterile, in its arrangement, but there, a drawer caught her attention, third from the top. Locked. Not unusual for a household, but it wasn't the lock, it was the way Gratham had paused by it earlier, his hand hovering just above the brass handle for a heartbeat too long before retreating like a man scorched by something unseen. It was fear, deep, instinctive fear, not of the drawer, but of what it represented. Agatha didn't touch it. She didn't have to. The truth in this house wasn't hidden in drawers, it was alive in the walls, seeping into the air, carried on the hesitant footsteps of the staff, and the heavy glances that lingered just a second too long. As she stepped back into the corridor, she caught another moment, Gratham again, passing by Victor in the hallway. Their exchange was subtle, silent, but the look they shared, it wasn't the look of servant and master, nor family and familiar, it was a look forged in doubt and suspicion, like two men silently questioning whether the other knew too little, or perhaps far too much. As the evening deepened and the walls of Ravenshade Manor seemed to absorb the silence like a long-held breath, Eleanor Gray stepped into her room, the faded scent of lavender and old wood wrapping around her like a forgotten memory. The manor, weathered by time, and the weight of too many whispered confessions, creaked beneath its own history. From behind lace curtains, Eleanor watched the moonlight spill silver over the garden, casting elongated shadows that clung to the earth like secrets unwilling to die. There, half consumed by the gloom, stood the head groundskeeper, Mr. Linley, motionless, his silhouette tense against the restless wind, his gaze locked on a patch of soil recently disturbed. The earth was unsettled, not just by footsteps, but by the kind of pacing that carves questions into the ground. His back was straight, but his spirit sagged, as if tethered to a memory too heavy to forget. Eleanor let the curtain fall with a whisper, her breath catching as the house seemed to exhale a warning through its very walls. Ravenshade wasn't merely a crumbling estate, it was a relic that had begun to bleed truth through every crack, each warped floorboard echoing with things left unsaid. The following dinner unfolded in a heavy quiet, where the scrape of utensils against porcelain felt intrusive, and conversation was little more than ritual. The air was thick, like the hush before a storm. Then, unexpectedly, Mr. Linley stood, his face pale, but his voice firm. "A toast," he announced, raising his glass with a tremor, only those watching closely could see, "to Ravenshade, and those whose silence has protected it, for better or worse." The words hovered, their meaning ambiguous, but sharp as a blade. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, tracking how Linley's gaze moved across the table, pausing just slightly too long on Lady Winthrop, whose wineglass clinked too loudly as she lifted it with forced grace. Young Edmund, the heir with too much charm and too little patience, laughed a second too late, and the housekeeper's eyes darted toward the fireplace, as if fearing something might crawl from it. The solicitor, cold and precise, stared down into his untouched meal, hands folded like a prayer he didn't believe in. Linley's words hadn't been a toast, they were a fracture. Eleanor felt it like a shift in pressure, a subtle cracking of the mask the house wore. She didn't knit like Miss Marple, but her hands stilled against the pages of a book she wasn't reading, heart thudding with a thrill she hadn't felt in years. That night, as the house settled into its uneasy slumber, Eleanor sat awake, knowing that something had been set in motion, and by morning, the hush was pierced by a scream. Mr. Linley was found dead, slumped in the chair beside his bed, an empty glass in hand, and the air heavy with something more bitter than spirits. His face held no peace, only the echo of things too long buried. The household reeled, cloaking shock in civility, but Eleanor saw it for what it was, not tragedy, but consequence. Ravenshade had started speaking, and secrets, once disturbed, do not return quietly to their graves. The rain had not fallen in days, yet the air at Wrenmore House was thick with the scent of damp earth, as though the very soil beneath its foundations harbored secrets it could not keep. The fog clung to the edges of the sprawling estate like a shroud, swallowing the sharp contours of the garden, and casting an eerie pall over the already somber atmosphere. From her vantage point by the tall window, Eliza Harrow observed the shifting shadows, her mind piecing together the disjointed fragments of the evening's events. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary of timeless grace, now seemed to pulse with an undercurrent of tension, its very walls groaning with the weight of its own history. The death of Mr. Denholm, the elderly butler, had been swift and, outwardly, unremarkable. He was found slumped in his armchair, the remnants of a half-full glass still clutched in his hand, his features frozen in a mask of discomfort. It seemed like an ordinary death at first, quiet, isolated, but then there were the peculiarities that Eliza could not shake. A playing card, the Jack of Hearts, had been tucked beneath his collar, its edges curled, as if someone had left it there with a deliberate, calculated gesture. The card was so ordinary yet so impossibly significant. Its presence was no coincidence, and Eliza knew it. It had been placed there for a reason, a reminder of something darker, something buried beneath the polished surfaces of this imposing manor. As the family gathered in the drawing room, mourning with all the expected formality of their station, Eliza could not ignore the undercurrents of unease that rippled through their interactions. The polite murmurs felt like a thin veneer over something far more sinister. Lady Adeline, the matriarch of Renmore, presided over the room with the detached grace of someone who had perfected the art of hiding her true emotions, but there was an edge to her calm demeanor that spoke of hidden fears. Her nephew, Gregory, sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap, his foot tapping a restless rhythm against the floor, his gaze darting nervously toward the solicitor, Mr. Thorne, whenever the topic of inheritance was broached. His body language screamed of impatience, but more than that, resentment. The housemaid, once a picture of cheerful efficiency, now moved about the room with a hesitant air, her eyes constantly shifting, as though she was being hunted by an invisible predator. It was not grief that had descended upon Renmore, Eliza realized, it was fear. Fear of the unknown, of what Denholm's death might reveal about the tangled web of lies and deceit that had festered within these walls for years. But it wasn't just the living that made Eliza uneasy. As she took in the scene around her, something else caught her attention, the faint but unmistakable trace of muddy footprints leading into the parlor, the soles of Denholm's polished shoes marked with streaks of earth that could not be ignored. It had not rained in days, and the grounds had been dry, yet the mud clung to his shoes with the stubbornness of a man who had walked where he should not have. There was no logical explanation for the soiled shoes. The butler was not one to wander aimlessly through the grounds, especially not after dark, and yet the evidence was there, plain for all to see. Denholm's shoes had ventured into a place that had been kept hidden, away from prying eyes, perhaps to the forbidden west wing, a part of the house that had been locked away for years, sealed off after the tragic accident that had claimed the life of the former Lord of Renmore. The mystery deepened further when Eliza's eyes fell upon the wine decanter on the side table, half filled with a rich red liquid. Yet Denholm's glass, abandoned by his side, reeked of something far stronger, something not served at the dinner table that evening, a liquor that did not belong to the evening's events, a drink that whispered of secrets exchanged in the dead of night. Then there was the card again, the Jack of Hearts. Its smudged corners seemed to mock her, daring her to unravel its meaning. Eliza had seen enough of life's hidden truths to know that this was no simple token. Cards were often used as symbols, markers left in place of words when silence was a safer bet, when a message needed to be delivered without being spoken. The Jack of Hearts was no random choice. It was the figure of a gambler, a man who risked everything on a game where the stakes were high and the consequences were far-reaching. Denholm's final hours had not been spent in quiet solitude, she realized. They had been spent in a game, a dangerous one, and someone had called his bluff. As the evening stretched on, Eliza's mind worked tirelessly to connect the dots, to sift through the hushed conversations and subtle gestures that surrounded her. The house was no longer a refuge. It was a place of calculation, of secrets lurking beneath every well-kept surface. Gregory's nervous glances, Lady Adeline's distracted air, the housemaid's sudden unease, they were all pieces of a larger puzzle, and Eliza was determined to find the shape they would form. In the midst of all the quiet tension, she remained a study in composure, offering tea and sympathy with a warmth that was entirely deliberate. She knew that truth, in all its messy, painful forms, often revealed itself in the smallest of moments, in the briefest of pauses. She would not confront them. No, she would let them come to her, slowly, as they always did. The house was trembling under the weight of its own past, and Eliza understood that the game was far from over. There was a deeper play at work here, one that stretched far beyond the death of a single man. It was a game that had been years in the making, and now it was unraveling, thread by thread, secret by secret. Renmore House had witnessed too much, and soon it would give up the ghosts it had long held in its cold embrace. Lady Arabella's smile, ever so bright yet a little too forced, fluttered on her lips like a moth drawn to a flame. Her hands, delicate but unsteady, danced nervously along the edge of her teacup, betraying the calm demeanor she tried so desperately to maintain. The solicitor, Mr. Whitaker, who should have been the epitome of controlled authority, looked strangely diminished, his once commanding stature now a shadow of what it had been. It was as if the weight of his profession had crushed him, and now every word he spoke seemed to shrink back from the room, as though even the air itself had grown too heavy for him to carry. The guests at Blackwood Hall, all seemingly well-bred and composed, wore their own hidden anxieties like cloaks, the weight of their secrets weighing heavily on them. Miss Marple, ever the observant soul, knew without the need for spoken words that each of them had arrived with something dark, something they'd hoped to leave behind in the quiet corridors of the estate. Lord Davenport's nephew, Charles, a young man whose name Miss Marple had briefly stored away, but never gave much thought to, now seemed to scream his predicament louder than words could convey. His forced cheerfulness grated against the stillness of the room. His jokes fell just short of humor, his laughter brittle and too sharp. Whenever talk turned to matters of inheritance, taxes, or the daunting repairs Blackwood Hall desperately needed, his smile cracked for a moment, revealing a glimpse of something deeper, desperation. Miss Marple had seen young men like him before, charming when the world was at their feet, reckless when fortune began to slip through their fingers. But now the facade was crumbling, and behind his words she could sense the true nature of his thoughts, a mind teetering on the edge of a precipice, where hope was a distant whisper, and debt was a gnawing presence he could no longer ignore. The mention of distant opportunities and investments seemed rehearsed, like a man grasping at straws, desperately trying to convince himself of possibilities that never truly existed. There was no talk of prospects, only a faint glimmer of a desperate wish, perhaps for a stroke of luck, or a timely inheritance, or better yet, a sudden death that might relieve him of his mounting burdens. Miss Marple nodded politely, her face serene, her knitting needles clicking together with the rhythmic cadence of a mind not at rest, but carefully observing, each detail being woven into her understanding. The housemaid, who had charmed her way into every room, every conversation, had something more to hide than mere pleasantries. Her movements were calculated, an artful dance between being invisible when necessary, and indispensable when noticed. Yet Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing women in service, saw through the facade. The housemaid's eyes darted, almost imperceptibly, toward the solicitor, her gaze sharpening and quick, as though she were tracking a familiar prey. There was history between them, Miss Marple was certain of it. A history not written in words but etched in invisible scars that only the keenest eyes could detect. The housemaid's chatter flowed too smoothly, her smile too polished, as though she feared silence above all else. For silence, Miss Marple knew, created room for questions, questions that once asked, could never be unsaid. Every time the solicitor shifted in his seat, her grip on the tray tightened ever so slightly, her fingers whitening, as if to keep herself grounded. But when the conversation turned to Mr. Hargrove's sudden death, Miss Marple's keen observation revealed more than any words could. The housemaid's smile, though still present, faltered, her knuckles turning white as the memory of death lingered in her hands. It was subtle, yet unmistakable. She had crossed a line, she had known him, perhaps too well. Miss Marple quietly added the housemaid's name to her list, not yet a suspect, but certainly someone who held the key to answers she was unwilling to give. The solicitor, growing increasingly uneasy, had been fidgeting all evening, his fingers nervously playing with the clasp of his briefcase, a constant unconscious motion that grew more pronounced with each passing moment. At last, with a theatrical sigh, he confessed aloud, as if compelled by some unseen force, "Important papers," he said, his voice tight, "gone." The tension in his tone was almost palpable, laced with the kind of indignation only someone with much to hide could muster. The papers, he claimed, had vanished between his arrival and the dinner hour. Documents of great importance, sensitive financial records, that if made public, would bring embarrassment to the family. But Miss Marple noticed something deeper, something more unsettling. Charles, the nephew, looked up suddenly, his eyes sharpening with interest. The housemaid's demeanor shifted ever so slightly, her back stiffening in a way that was both too quick and too calculated. Even Lady Clara, whose composure had been her hallmark, seemed to blanch, though she kept her silence. The solicitor's protestations of righteous frustration were to Miss Marple's practiced ears a mask, one worn to disguise the true terror that lurked beneath. For it was not just the loss of papers that had him on edge, it was the realization that someone else knew what those papers contained, and worse, that they were no longer under his control. Miss Marple could feel the room shifting, the atmosphere thickening with unspoken truths. The missing papers were only the surface of the deeper rot that ran through Blackwood Hall. Later, when the house had quieted into a restless stillness, Miss Marple decided to take one of her habitual walks through the corridors. It was not for exercise, it was for observation. The hallway outside, Mr. Hargrove's quarters, was empty, but the carpet near his door caught her attention. A faint smudge of earth marred the otherwise pristine floor, shaped into the unmistakable print of a shoe, fresh, still damp. It was a small thing, but it was enough to confirm that someone had been there recently, someone who didn't belong. And suddenly, Miss Marple's mind began to weave together the tangled threads of her observations, each look, each word, each silent gesture. Blackwood Hall was not merely a house of secrets, it was a place where those secrets were carefully guarded, hidden beneath layers of politeness and decorum. But Miss Marple, with her patient unhurried ways, knew that all walls, no matter how thick, could crumble under the weight of the truth. The night had drawn on, the uneasy silence of Blackwood Hall only broken by the faint rustle of curtains swaying in a forgotten breeze. Yet Miss Marple's mind was far from quiet. Each step she took seemed measured, deliberate, as if she were a part of the house itself, watchful, unobtrusive. Her eyes had noticed the print left by a small light foot, delicate enough to suggest it didn't belong to any of the expected residents, but to someone who carried secrets heavier than their steps. The small footprint, still faintly damp, held more than just a trace of soil. It was a whispered message. Someone had been here, in Mr. Hargrove's quarters, someone who had dared to visit him in the dead of night, too anxious to wait until dawn. The gentle echo of her shoes against the polished floor contrasted sharply with the storm of thoughts that churned within her. She bent down to inspect the evidence with the care of a seasoned detective, her knitting momentarily forgotten. As she tried to piece together the story, the house whispered to her. The secretive nature of the visitor, the stillness that followed, was telling. It spoke of hidden motives, long-buried fears, and a growing desperation in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. A man like Mr. Hargrove, with a shadowy past steeped in debts and questionable choices, was hardly the kind to be left untouched by his mistakes. Her suspicions were already forming, as sure as the rising tide of secrets that swirled around Blackwood Hall. At the local pub, the whispers had deepened, the landlord's tale a fitting piece to the puzzle. Hargrove, once a man of quiet resolve, had turned up unexpectedly, his past as vivid as the whiskey in his glass. The stranger with him, a man whose presence reeked of danger, someone not easily forgotten, had stirred the landlord's memory. And then, the betting slip, a fragile charred corner found by the cold fireplace in the drawing-room, tucked between forgotten ashes, its name still legible, Hargrove. Miss Marple's fingers had brushed it, so delicate, as if it held more than just ink and paper. It held a truth that someone, somewhere would do anything to bury. The slip, hastily destroyed but left behind in haste, spoke of a desperate attempt to erase a past that wasn't easily forgotten. Gambling, once an escape, now a trap that had ensnared someone with too much to lose. Yet it wasn't just the money at stake, it was something deeper, something more insidious. Someone in Blackwood Hall had been protecting not just a secret, but their future, a future shaped by shadows and lies. Miss Marple had known it then, even before Lady Clara's nephew had blurted out his accusation, the flimsy confidence in his voice betraying him as he presented the slip, a pathetic attempt to throw suspicion where it did not belong. A man desperate enough to fabricate a tale of blackmail, but not enough to cover his own tracks. In that moment, the threads of the mystery grew tighter, wrapping around everyone in the house, their fates all linked to something far darker than they cared to admit. Miss Marple, knitting once more, allowed the faintest of smiles to pass her lips. Soon the truth would unravel itself, as it always did. The atmosphere within the walls of Blackwood Hall had an eerie weight to it, as though the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. Miss Marple sat there in the drawing-room, her knitting resting in her lap, but her mind was working furiously, untangling the knots of a mystery that had only just begun to reveal its true shape. The nephew's voice had been loud, urgent, as if he believed the words spilling from his mouth were enough to clear the fog surrounding the death of Mr. Harrove. But Miss Marple knew better. The tale he told, the story of blackmail, the threatening letter, the gambling debts, sounded all too rehearsed for someone who had just discovered the facts. His outrage was too perfect, too convenient. The more Miss Marple listened, the more she realized that this story, this neatly packaged narrative of Harrove's final desperate scheme, had been carefully crafted for her. A victim here, a villain there, and everything in between fell into place with an unnerving precision that only a seasoned observer could detect as a carefully orchestrated performance. There was something hollow about it, a void where the real truth should have been, and Miss Marple, ever the keen observer, could see that the timeline he presented was far too clean, the details of the blackmail scheme too well constructed. It was as though someone had placed all the pieces before her, nudging her to see a picture that wasn't entirely true. She listened, her hand still as she sipped her tea, but her mind was racing. In her many years of unraveling mysteries, she had learned that truth never came in such a tidy package. The sharp, jagged edges, the unspoken parts of the story, were always the pieces that led to real answers. As the nephew spun his tale, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted back to the betting slip. Yes, it had been found, but she had seen enough to know that this wasn't an accident. The slip wasn't a smoking gun, it was a carefully placed clue, meant to send them all in the wrong direction. Someone wanted them to believe in blackmail, to wrap up the case neatly, to tie the loss of Mr. Harrove's life to a final tragic mistake. But that didn't sit right with Miss Marple. It was too simple, too convenient. She sipped her tea again, her gaze wandering to the window, where the early morning mist hung like a veil over the garden. The mist was dense, thick, like the secrets buried in the house's history. Secrets that had been there long before Mr. Harrove's death. Secrets that had been buried deep beneath layers of time and silence. No, it wasn't Harrove's gambling that had led to his end. It was something much older, something far more dangerous. A truth that had been hidden for decades, and now, like a wound that refuses to heal, it was beginning to bleed again. And as the day turned into evening, bringing a calmness that only deepened the mystery, Miss Marple could feel the pieces of the puzzle shifting ever closer into place. She began to search through the old inventory ledgers of Blackwood Hall, flipping through the fragile pages with delicate care. Each entry, meticulously recorded, bore witness to the passage of time. There were lists of silver candlesticks, platters, and serving spoons, each item catalogued with pride. Yet, it was the sudden absence of something that caught her attention. In 1895, a full set of engraved silver had been recorded as present. By 1903, it was gone, with no note, no explanation, just a void. The silence that followed the disappearance of the silver seemed more telling than any confession could have been. In homes like Blackwood Hall, silver didn't vanish without a reason. It wasn't misplaced or forgotten. It was either pawned in secret or stolen under the guise of trust, and Miss Marple was sure of one thing: someone knew the truth. Her fingertip traced the faded ink on the ledger, the words barely visible beneath years of dust. This wasn't a trivial matter lost to the past. This was a thread, and it led straight to Mr. Harrove himself, a man who had served Blackwood Hall for decades, a butler whose loyalty had been unquestioned. He had polished every goblet, dusted every chandelier, yet never once did he mention the missing silver. This silence, Miss Marple thought, was not the silence of a careless man, it was the silence of someone who knew more than they were letting on. Harrove, despite his past mistakes, had never been reckless. He wasn't the kind of man who would gamble away his wages, and yet, the temptation to pawn a family heirloom would have been strong, especially for someone who had lived a life bound by duty. But Harrove had never been a man to succumb to such temptation, not openly anyway. If the silver had gone missing on his watch, it wasn't because of greed. There was something deeper, something more complicated at play here. Harrove's death wasn't a simple accident or a tragic consequence of bad choices. It was part of something far more intricate, something tied to the house itself, and its long-buried secrets. Miss Marple knew now that Harrove had not just been a victim of circumstance, he had been a key player in a far older mystery, one that had been hidden for years, perhaps even decades. His silence, his loyalty to Blackwood Hall, had been the key to something far darker than anyone realized. And as Miss Marple sat there, knitting her quiet thread in the shadow of the house, she knew that the needle was about to point in a direction that no one had expected. The past was rising again, and it would not be denied. The air in Blackwood Hall felt heavy, thick with secrets that clung to the old walls, and Miss Marple could almost hear the house sighing under the weight of its history. Every crack in the floorboards, every shadow in the corners seemed to whisper of things long buried, things that had been carefully concealed in the name of loyalty and family. As she sat by the fire, her knitting abandoned in her lap, Miss Marple's mind spun with thoughts that turned like the gears of a clock, each thought more troubling than the last. Harrove's death had shattered the delicate veneer of propriety that the Hall had long prided itself on, yet Miss Marple sensed something far more insidious at play, something buried deeper than any outward grief or outrage could account for. The nephew's accusations, quick and full of fury, spoke of debts, gambling losses and blackmail, but Miss Marple couldn't shake the sense that these were convenient truths, shaped to fit a narrative that someone wanted her to believe. Harrove, she knew, had been too clean, too upright a man for such a sordid end. He had lived by a code of loyalty, not just to the family but to something far more intangible, something that even his death could not erase. But now, the more Miss Marple considered the pieces of the puzzle, the more it seemed like someone had deliberately crafted a story, laid it out for her to follow like breadcrumbs. That someone had wanted the truth to be hidden, and they had worked hard to ensure she wouldn't look too closely. The idea of Harrove, a man of such integrity, falling to the temptation of theft felt wrong. The silver, so important, so symbolic, could not simply have disappeared for the sake of a gambling debt. No, it seemed far more likely that Harrove had done something far less selfish, something rooted in loyalty so strong that it consumed him. What if Harrove had not stolen the silver for himself? What if he had done it to protect someone else? His continued presence in the house after the supposed theft, why hadn't he left? A thief would have disappeared, fled to some distant place to avoid the consequences, yet Harrove had stayed, as if bound to the house by something far more powerful than fear of retribution. It struck Miss Marple that Harrove had remained because the silence he kept was a promise, a debt not paid with money but with secrecy. He had spent years watching over this secret, protecting it from the prying eyes of the world, all the while bearing the weight of it alone. He had paid for silence with silence, and now, years later, that silence was beginning to crack. Miss Marple could almost hear it, like the faintest tap on the door in the dead of night, a knock heralding the arrival of a debt long overdue, demanding its reckoning. And then the housemaid appeared, eyes averted, hands twisting the corner of her apron. Her discomfort was palpable, her words slow, deliberate, as if the very act of speaking the truth might destroy her. She had witnessed it, she confessed, the argument between Harrove and the solicitor, late one night, the words sharp, whispered with a venom that could cut through bone. The housemaid hadn't heard everything, but she had heard enough. enough to understand that the silver was not simply a matter of theft, it was bound up in something far darker. She recalled hearing the solicitor mention debts long settled, secrets that no longer needed to be kept. And Harrow's response had been quiet but fierce, his voice carrying a warning or perhaps a plea. Miss Marple did not press for more. She knew that the most valuable confessions were not wrested out with force, but rather they fell naturally into the silence, like a fruit ripening on the branch until it could no longer hold its weight. The housemaid left, her shoulders slumped with the relief of finally speaking her piece, but Miss Marple could see through the girl's discomfort. She could read between the lines, hear the unspoken words left hanging in the air. There was more, so much more, but the housemaid wasn't ready to confess it. Miss Marple knew, however, that the truth could only remain hidden for so long. Secrets, like the silver, had a way of tarnishing in the dark. The housemaid's fragmentary account had been the first thread to unravel, but Miss Marple could feel the entire tapestry of Harrow's final days beginning to tear at the seams. The missing silver, the solicitor's cryptic words, the faint whispers of blackmail, and the quiet desperation in Harrow's final toast, they were all connected. The pieces weren't just linked by chance, they were part of a larger story, a story not of theft, but of trust and betrayal, of debts paid in silence, and loyalty bought at a far higher price than anyone could have imagined. Miss Marple felt the weight of it press down on her as the pieces clicked into place. It wasn't just about stolen silver or ruined reputations, it was about misplaced loyalty, about secrets too dangerous to be spoken aloud. And when silence is kept for too long, it becomes something much sharper, something far more dangerous. Harrow's death hadn't been an accident. It had been too neatly arranged, like a scene carefully staged for the observer's eye, to mislead and misdirect. The death itself had been part of the plan, part of the manipulation. The trick, Miss Marple realized, was not to follow the path that had been set before her, but to step off it entirely, and look at the story from a different angle, one where the hidden truth lay just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The more Miss Marple thought about it, the clearer it became. Harrow's death wasn't an unfortunate consequence of his actions, it was the culmination of years of carefully hidden truths, of debts that had been paid in silence, and of loyalty that had twisted into something far darker. The missing silver, the solicitor's strange behavior, the veiled threats, all of it was part of a larger game. One where the stakes were far higher than anyone had ever realized. As the wind began to howl outside and the first drops of rain splattered against the window, Miss Marple understood. The time had come to bring the truth into the light, to wash away the years of darkness and silence. The solicitor, whose nervous manner had been so noticeable all morning, was now avoiding Miss Marple with growing desperation, clutching his briefcase like a shield from the storm brewing within himself. It wasn't until they found themselves alone, the house quiet save for the crackling of the fire, that Miss Marple finally spoke. She had known all along that the answer lay in the spaces between the words, in the moments of hesitation and silence, and now, with all the pieces finally in place, she was ready to lay the truth bare. The game was over, the silver, the blackmail, the lies, they were all part of a greater truth, one that would now be revealed, no longer to be hidden in the shadows. Miss Marple had known, all along, that the real answer was not in the theft of the silver, but in the silence that had kept it buried for so long. And now, that silence was finally breaking, piece by piece, until the whole, ugly truth was laid bare. The sound of distant clattering crockery reverberated through the hall, the clink of glass and china like a muted drumbeat, echoing in the cold, dimly lit room. With every word that fell from the solicitor's lips, it felt as though he was trying to pry each syllable from his own conscience, his voice heavy with regret. Years ago, he began slowly, there was a theft, one not from outside the house but from within. Valuable silver, gone. Miss Marple sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her face as calm as a still lake, yet beneath the surface, her mind was already racing, connecting invisible dots, weaving together threads that were far from simple. The solicitor's voice quivered as he continued, speaking of Harrow's discovery of the theft. He could have exposed the culprit, but he chose silence. Loyalty, perhaps, or something more complicated. There was a hesitation, a crack in the otherwise professional exterior, that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. a subtle tremor in his fingers, a falter in his voice when he spoke that word, loyalty. It was a word that, to Miss Marple's trained ears, tasted faintly of guilt, as though it were too often confused with the darker, more dangerous cousin of betrayal. The solicitor leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. He kept that silence for years, and it cost him, he said, his words lingering in the air like smoke. Miss Marple nodded slightly, her expression unwavering, but her thoughts were far from still. Loyalty, she knew, was a double-edged sword, one that could bind a person so tightly to another that they would suffocate, unable to breathe without the other's consent. But Harrow's silence, it seemed, had not been an act of self-preservation. No, it had been far more perilous, an act of protection for someone within the house, someone whose secret was far too dangerous to reveal. The theft had been quiet, undramatic. No smashed locks, no broken glass, yet the loss was undeniable. And Harrow, faced with the knowledge of who had stolen the silver, had made the fateful decision to shield the culprit. Miss Marple's mind turned swiftly, the pieces falling into place. It was not loyalty born of affection, she suspected, but of something far more insidious: complicity. A shared burden, a weight that tied both parties together in an unspoken pact, a pact that left them shackled to each other, unable to move without pulling the other into the abyss. But silence, Miss Marple knew, was like an unpaid debt. It accumulated interest over time, growing heavier with each passing year. What had begun as a single act of concealment had transformed into a life marred by quiet fear. Every glance at the silver cabinet had become a reminder of the truth they had chosen to bury. Every unexpected knock at the door, an unspoken threat. And now, with the family's estate crumbling and old debts resurfacing, that silence could no longer hold. Harrow, it seemed, had made a decision in the weeks leading up to his death. He would confess everything, not to punish, but to unburden himself of the secret that had been eating away at him for years. It was a desperate gamble, an act of long overdue honesty from a man who had spent too many years confusing silence with loyalty. But honesty, Miss Marple knew, was a dangerous thing in a house built on secrets. By the time Harrow had raised his glass for the toast, his mind was made up. He would expose the truth, no matter the cost. What he hadn't realized, however, was that someone else had already calculated that cost, and determined it was far too high to bear. The playing card, the Queen of Spades, tucked into Harrow's waistcoat, had puzzled Miss Marple from the start. It had seemed too deliberate, too theatrical, for a man like Harrow, an act that felt out of place on a man so meticulous, so controlled. It wasn't until the solicitor's confession that the memories of certain gambling codes whispered in dimly lit rooms, began to stir in the back of her mind. Cards like that, Miss Marple knew, held meaning far beyond mere decoration. A Queen of Spades, placed deliberately in a man's possession, was not simply a gambler's farewell. It was a message, a reminder that debts once incurred must be paid. But as Miss Marple pondered further, she realized the card had not been placed there for Harrow. It had been meant for someone else entirely, someone who had once held the silver, only to let it slip through their fingers. Harrow had become the messenger, but the message was meant for a hand that had long since abandoned the silver, yet still clung to the ghosts of that lost wealth. The Queen of Spades was not a symbol of luck's fickle nature, it was the blackmailer's whispered threat, passed through the dead to reach the living. The card, Miss Marple realized, had been placed for a purpose far more sinister than Harrow could have ever anticipated. It was a final warning, one that would not be ignored. In the dim, shadowed heart of Blackwood Hall, the atmosphere grew heavier, as though even the walls themselves sensed the brewing storm. The theft, once a faint whisper in the halls, had evolved into something far darker, an insidious secret that wound its way through the house, its presence felt in every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of candlelight. Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, knew the silent game at play. She could almost taste the fear that hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as she pieced together the puzzle. The card, the Queen of Spades, no longer held the simple meaning of a gambler's token, but had transformed into something far more dangerous. It wasn't Harrove's guilt it spoke of. It was a warning, a message to someone within the house, someone who had seen the theft, understood its magnitude, and now feared the truth would come to light. The card's quiet language had reached its intended target, and in that moment, everything shifted. The culprit had moved swiftly, quietly, but with deadly precision. The decision to silence Harrove had been made, but it had come at a cost. The truth. Miss Marple's sharp eyes flickered as she saw it. The long-hidden secret, now slowly unraveling, like a thread pulled free from a tangled knot. The theft, the loyalty, the fear, they were all parts of a larger, far more intricate scheme that no one had dared to expose until now. With every passing moment, the pieces aligned, and the web grew tighter. In the days before his death, Harrove had become a man on the brink, haunted by his own conscience, tormented by the knowledge that silence had only protected the guilty. But silence, Miss Marple knew, was a deadly thing in a house built on secrets. She could feel the weight of the truth pressing down, inching ever closer, like a tide rising to swallow everything in its path. And then, in the village pub, the final piece slid into place. The name spoken, half forgotten, half feared, stirred something in the old villagers, a whisper of the past that had long since been buried. The footman, disgraced and forgotten, had returned, not out of nostalgia, but to finish what had been started so many years ago. His eyes, sharp and calculating, had seen what others had missed, and now he was back, not as a servant, but as a man with a vendetta, armed with knowledge no one else dared to acknowledge. The air in the pub shifted as Miss Marple's quiet questioning pried open the doors to a past that refused to stay silent. The footman had not come to reminisce, but to settle a score, to unearth a truth that had been buried under years of shame and silence. And in that moment, Miss Marple understood, this was no longer about a simple theft, but a deadly game of loyalty, revenge, and buried secrets, where each step taken led closer to a reckoning that none could escape. As Blackwood Hall loomed in the distance, its crumbling silhouette a testament to centuries of secrets and betrayals, the air seemed to carry a weight far heavier than the damp chill of the evening fog. The house, once a proud estate, had become a prisoner of its own past, its walls steeped in guilt, and its halls echoing with the sounds of a history that refused to remain buried. The footman's return was not a simple matter, it was a reckoning that had been long in the making. His coat, threadbare from years of hardship, fluttered against his frame, yet his eyes, sharp and calculating, spoke of a man who had seen far more than he should have. He had once carried the shovel, dug the graves, and buried the sins of Blackwood Hall deep in the earth. Now he had returned, not as a humble servant, but as a man on a mission, determined to claim what was rightfully his. His presence in the village had sent ripples through the quiet community. His voice, once subdued, now carried the confidence of someone who knew exactly where the bodies were hidden, and perhaps more chillingly, why they had been buried in the first place. He spoke of the silver, the treasure that had gone missing decades ago, and of the mysterious disappearance of the First Lady Blackwood. The official story had always been that she died from a sudden fever, an unfortunate illness that struck without warning, but the footman's smirk suggested otherwise. His cryptic words hinted at a darker truth, one that had been kept hidden for far too long. The footman was not merely a witness to these events, he was the keeper of secrets that could tear Blackwood Hall apart. He was not there to ask for mercy or forgiveness, but to remind those in power that secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, could not remain locked away forever. It was clear now that his return was no accident. He had come to settle scores, to bring the truth to light, and in doing so to dismantle the very foundation of the house that had cast him aside so many years ago. Miss Marple, standing at the edge of the village, could almost picture the scene. Two men sitting in the dim, smoky light of the local pub. One was Harrove, the ever-loyal butler of Blackwood Hall, and the other, the footman, the man who had once been a part of the household, until he had been discarded like a mere afterthought. The two men who had once shared a bond of duty, now shared a memory, one they both knew was dangerous, one that could bring the entire house to its knees if it were ever brought into the light. Harrove, ever the guardian of the house's secrets, had likely believed that silence would keep them safe. But the footman's return was a clear message. The time for silence had passed. Harrove's carefully constructed world of loyalty and discretion was crumbling around him, and the weight of his choices was beginning to crush him. As Miss Marple walked towards Blackwood Hall, the rain fell in sheets, soaking her shawl and dampening the earth beneath her feet. Her mind was racing, piecing together the fragments of a puzzle she knew she was close to solving. The footman's return could have been motivated by a thirst for revenge, a final act of defiance against the house that had betrayed him. But Miss Marple knew that people rarely acted purely out of vengeance. There was something more, perhaps money, a bribe to keep his silence, or perhaps a twisted form of justice. Harrove, caught between his duty to protect the house and the shame of his own actions, was a man trapped in a moral quagmire. Had the footman blackmailed him, threatening to expose the truth behind the missing silver and the death of Lady Blackwood? Or had the footman pushed Harrove to confront the past, forcing him to face the guilt that had gnawed at him for years? Miss Marple could not yet say which, but she knew one thing for certain: Harrove's death was not the end of this mystery. No, it was only the beginning of a far more dangerous unraveling. The butler's demise had set in motion a chain of events that would force the walls of Blackwood Hall to yield their secrets. Some mysteries once disturbed could never be silenced. They clawed at locked doors, slipped through cracks in the walls, and waited for the right moment to be heard. And the time for silence was running out. By the time Miss Marple reached the house, the sky above was a bruised canvas, the clouds heavy and oppressive. Blackwood Hall stood in the midst of the storm, its facade as silent and unyielding as ever. But Miss Marple knew the truth. This house was not haunted by ghosts or specters, but by the living, those who could never forget the past, and those who refused to face it. Harrove had been one such ghost, a man so steeped in guilt and silence that he had become a part of the house itself. The solicitor, the housemaid, even Lady Clara, each of them had their own ghosts, their own sins, and now the footman had returned, not to haunt the house, but to force it to confront what had been buried for so long. Miss Marple paused at the threshold, her fingers resting lightly on the weathered door. The weight of the house seemed to press in on her, but she was undeterred. Some houses, she thought, are not haunted by the dead at all. They are haunted by the living, the ones who cannot forget, and the ones who refuse to be forgotten. The rain had washed the garden clean, leaving the earth dark and heavy beneath her feet. She moved slowly, retracing Harrove's steps from the night of his death. The ground was still damp, but there were no footprints to mark the way. Yet for Miss Marple, footprints were never just traces of mud. They were choices made visible, proof of hesitation, of decision, and of paths taken. The garden, with its carefully manicured hedges and moonlit corners, was far more than a mere ornament at Blackwood Hall. It was a place where secrets had been whispered, where deals had been struck under the cover of night. It was here that Harrove had come, not for solace, but for a meeting, one that had been long overdue. His life of silence and loyalty had finally cracked under the weight of the truth, and now the past was demanding to be heard. Miss Marple stood in the place where the grass gave way to gravel, her hands folded before her, her mind working furiously to piece together the final fragments of the story. The rain had washed the earth clean, but it could never wash away the choices that had been made here, under the shelter of the garden's shadows. And as Miss Marple stood there, she knew with chilling certainty that the truth was within reach, that the end of one mystery was only the beginning of a far more dangerous game. Blackwood Hall stood as an ominous silhouette, its decaying stone walls murmuring secrets that had never seen the light of day. The chill of the evening fog seemed to carry more than just the weight of the night. It clung to the air, thick with the unsaid, a silence that held its breath as if the very earth knew something was about to shift. Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, found herself at the edge of the garden once again, piecing together the quiet carnage that had unfolded on the night of Harrove's death. The footman's return had set things in motion. But it was the butler's final moments that truly painted the picture of a man caught in a web of his own making. Harrove had stood beneath the great oak tree, his coat drawn tightly against the wind, eyes strained under the weight of a conversation that was never meant to happen. The visitor had arrived without a flourish, no booming threats or angry demands. Instead, there was a chilling calm about the man, a quiet confidence that hinted at a deeper understanding of what had been hidden within the walls of Blackwood Hall for so long. There were no raised voices in that garden, not at first. Too many windows, too many eyes. But words, Miss Marple knew, had a way of cutting through silence far sharper than any blade. The exchange had been laced with veiled threats, heavy pauses, and the kind of implication that could set the heart racing. Harrove, the loyal butler, had protested, at first with grace, then with panic, as the conversation turned darker. Fear, Miss Marple understood, was a powerful catalyst, and Harrove, a man who had spent his life in servitude, was no stranger to it. But it was fear that made men reckless, and Harrove was no exception. His protests grew more desperate, more frantic, each word a plea for mercy that no one intended to offer. It was clear that his visitor hadn't come to negotiate but to end the conversation forever, to end it with finality. Harrove, sensing the truth slipping away, must have made a last-ditch effort, offering something, anything to turn the tide. Perhaps it was money, perhaps it was silence, perhaps it was the bitterest of truths, twisted and reshaped into a bargaining chip that might buy him one last chance. But Miss Marple knew better than anyone that desperation could not be disguised, and it had never made for a winning hand. The offer was rejected before it even had a chance to take root, not because it lacked value, but because the visitor had already made up their mind. Loyalty, Harrove's greatest strength and perhaps his fatal flaw, had led him to believe that his silence could still protect him. But loyalty, Miss Marple reflected, was rarely returned in kind. The game had ended before Harrove even knew it had started. The conversation, so carefully restrained, had given way to something darker, more physical. A hand gripping a sleeve, a stumble backward into the muddy earth, and in that single fleeting moment, the realization dawned, there was no going back. The words had been spoken, the truth was out. And in the cold night, beneath the ancient tree, Harrove understood that survival no longer required loyalty, it required silence. He had always been the keeper of secrets, but now, his own secret had become a noose around his neck. Harrove's instinct would have been to retreat, to calm the situation, to preserve the fragile order of his world. But the other figure, so purposefully resolute, was beyond calming. This was a man who had no interest in bargaining, no use for empty promises. He knew Harrove's secret, knew the truth that the butler had buried so long ago. And in the end it was that knowledge that sealed Harrove's fate. A shove, a misstep, a fall. It was not murder in the traditional sense, no premeditated plot, no clear malice, but it was violence born of fear. Fear, Miss Marple knew, had a way of turning the simplest of encounters into something far darker. It was that very fear that had sealed Harrove's fate in a single devastating instant. Had he been helped to his feet, Miss Marple wondered. Had the situation been allowed to settle, perhaps Harrove would have returned to the safety of the house, his loyalty intact. But that wasn't what happened. The one who had come to the garden with such cold resolve, knew what Harrove was about to do, knew that his silence had become too great a liability to be allowed to stand. And so, in the span of a breath, Harrove's life was extinguished, not in fury, not in anger, but in the cold, calculated recognition that some secrets were better left buried. The rain, relentless as ever, washed away the evidence of what had happened in the garden, covering up the worst of it. But it couldn't wash away the truth that clung to the house, that seemed to seep out of every crack and crevice. The truth was still there, hidden in plain sight, like a shadow that refused to be ignored. And now, Miss Marple realized, it was time to unravel that truth, to pull at the threads and see how far they reached. Because beneath the silent exterior of Blackwood Hall, there was more to be uncovered, more to be exposed, and no one, least of all Harrove, could stop it now. The game was far from over. The rain fell in an endless muted cascade against the windows of Blackwood Hall, its soft patter only deepening the heavy oppressive silence that clung to the grand house like a shroud. The weight of years of untold secrets, of quiet betrayals, of long-forgotten sins, hung in the air, thicker than the damp mist curling through the halls. In the drawing room, a motley assembly of people stood scattered like shadows, their eyes darting uneasily from one another, each waiting for the inevitable, but none daring to speak. Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, an unassuming figure at the edge of the gathering, her sharp eyes observing the nervous movements of those around her. To an outsider, she would have seemed nothing more than a kindly elderly woman lost in her knitting, but her gaze, calm, composed and penetrating, saw through the layers of deception that clothed each person in that room. The tension in the room was palpable, an electric hum of suppressed fears and guilty consciences. No one wanted to be the first to admit what they already knew in their hearts: the truth was near. It loomed just out of reach, like a dark cloud on the horizon, promising a storm that would wash away the carefully constructed facades. There was no need for accusations here. Miss Marple understood that the time for those had passed. The truth had already begun to slip from the shadows, its slow revelation inevitable, as the rain that seeped into the earth, unnoticed until it was too late. This truth, Miss Marple knew, had been buried long ago, not in a moment of passion or violence, but in the quiet, insidious theft of something seemingly inconsequential, a silver set from Blackwood Hall. At first, its absence had gone unnoticed, a missing spoon or fork here and there, hardly worth a second thought. But over time, the small disappearances had added up, until the full weight of the loss could no longer be ignored. This theft, Miss Marple understood, was no ordinary crime. It was not born of greed or malicious intent, it had been a quiet, desperate act, an act of survival. The thief, she suspected, had not stolen for profit, but out of a growing sense of desperation. A sense that something had to be done before it was too late. Someone in that house had been living in the grip of mounting debts, their options narrowing with every passing day. The silver was taken, piece by piece, not in a bold dramatic gesture, but in a way that allowed the thief to remain unseen, hidden in plain sight, moving unnoticed through the house, a shadow among shadows. Harrove had known, of course. He had seen the small signs, the way the silver set no longer matched, the way the thief had been careful, almost too careful, in their movements. But instead of confronting the person responsible, he had chosen the path of silence. A silence that, at the time, seemed to offer the only way out. To reveal the thief would have destroyed more than one reputation, shattered lives in ways far deeper than the loss of silver. So Harrove had chosen to remain quiet, to let the theft pass into the background, swallowed up by the secrets of Blackwood Hall. But silence, Miss Marple knew, is a fragile thing. It is a delicate balance, and the longer it is held, the more dangerous it becomes. The years passed, and the theft was forgotten by most. The silver was replaced, the house returned to its stately routine, but the silence remained. That is, until the day when Harrove, his position at Blackwood Hall becoming ever more precarious, saw an opening, a final chance to secure his future. His gamble was simple: he would reveal the truth. Not in a dramatic accusation, not in a way that would cast blame, but as leverage, an insurance policy for his own comfort in retirement. He would offer the truth, just enough to ensure his security, and in doing so, he hoped to buy the protection he so desperately needed. But Miss Marple knew the fatal flaw in Harrove's plan. Desperation is a contagious thing. For every person who is desperate to reveal the truth, there is another who is just as desperate to keep it hidden. Harrove's final toast, the one that had seemed like a celebration, the one that promised freedom, was in fact the first step toward his undoing. His gamble, made in the hope of securing a peaceful future, had instead sealed his death. For in the quiet, unassuming way Harrove had approached the matter, he had failed to account for the ripple effect his actions would create. The housemaid, standing nervously by the door, had seen the change in Harrove's manner the night he had made his ill-fated decision. She had noticed the way his eyes lingered on Lady Clara, the solicitor, and herself, a silent acknowledgement that the past was coming to light. She had known, as the others did not, that Harrove's decision would send the house into turmoil. There were those who had more to lose than just their reputation, and for them, the truth was an enemy more dangerous than any thief. Now, as Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten in her lap, her calm gaze moved over the room, watching each person closely. She had not gathered them here to accuse or to punish. That was never her way. No, she had brought them here to explain, to untangle the sequence of events that had led to Mr. Harrove's death, to make sure that no one would mistake it for a simple tragedy. It was never simple. Not in a house like this, where every corner held a secret, every face a story half told. Miss Marple's voice, when it came, was soft, but there was steel in her words. It was never about the silver, she said, her eyes flickering to each of the faces in turn. It was about what the silver represented, what silence could preserve. The room held its breath as Miss Marple continued, her words falling like soft stones into the still waters of their nerves. Harrove knew the truth. He had kept it hidden for years, polished silver that no longer matched, watched as the thief lived on untouched. But silence, my dear friends, she paused, her gaze sweeping over the room once more, is a difficult thing to hold. And the truth always finds its way out. Always. The housemaid trembled as she remembered that night, the way Harrove had grown more restless, the way the air had thickened with anticipation. She had felt it then, the inevitable return of the past. The truth, she knew, would unravel them all. But Miss Marple, with the same quiet resolve that had guided her through countless mysteries, was ready to pull the thread, to unravel the carefully woven lies. The pieces were all in place now, and soon, everyone in the room would understand that what had started with a stolen spoon was about to become something far more dangerous. The truth had been waiting for this moment. And with it, Blackwood Hall would never be the same again. The rain hammered against the ancient windows of Blackwood Hall, its relentless rhythm a quiet symphony to the secrets it concealed. In the dim light, the atmosphere seemed to thicken, a layer of tension settling over the room like a shroud. The residents, each a prisoner of their own guilt and fear, sat in silence, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Miss Marple sat by the hearth, her hands poised with knitting needles that moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm. To the casual observer, she was nothing more than an elderly woman, lost in her simple task. But beneath the calm exterior of her presence, there was a razor-sharp mind at work, dissecting the events that had unfolded with the precision of a surgeon. She knew, she always knew. The thief, the one who had taken the silver all those years ago, wasn't driven by greed or desperation. It was not for herself, but at the footman's urging. The footman, a man she had once trusted, had returned to Blackwood Hall not for love, but for the debt he believed he was owed. He had used the housemaid, a pawn in a game she did not fully understand. She had followed Harrove that fateful night, not to harm him, but to beg for silence. To beg him not to reveal what had happened. But panic is a wild beast. When Harrove had refused to listen, when his voice had risen in defiance, it had awakened something in her, a primal fear, a desperation to stop him, to silence him, no matter the cost. The push she had meant to be nothing more than a warning, a plea for mercy, had become too forceful, too sudden, too sharp. It was never meant to kill him. But panic does not heed reason. Miss Marple's voice, soft and gentle, cut through the silence like a blade. It was not evil that killed him, she said, her gaze sweeping over the room, it was fear. And fear, my dear friends, is the most dangerous guest of all. The playing card found in Harrove's waistcoat had puzzled everyone at first. It seemed like a gambler's trinket, a relic of a life long past. But it was not Harrove's card. It was a message meant for someone else, someone who had more to lose than the footman or the housemaid. The solicitor. It was a warning, a reminder that debts were owed, not just in currency, but in secrets. And these debts, like shadows, never fade. The solicitor, ever the calculating mind, had feared that card. He knew its meaning all too well. It was not simply a memento of Harrove's past, it was a silent threat, a promise that what had been buried could be unearthed, that the sins of the past could be revealed again at a cost. Harrove had intercepted the message, perhaps even understood it, but by the time he realized the true danger, it was already too late. The card had done its work. It had terrified the housemaid into action. It was not the card that had killed Harrove, but the weight of the secret it carried. The secret that had been buried for so long, festering in the dark corners of Blackwood Hall. Miss Marple held up the card, its edges frayed, the once bright design now faded and worn. "It was never just a gambler's card," she murmured. "It was a final demand for silence, paid in blood." The room was still, each person locked in their own world of reflection, as Miss Marple's words resonated through the space. Lady Clara's face had drained of color, the housemaid's grip on her apron so tight it looked as if it might tear. The solicitor, ever the stoic, had sunk into a chair, his face drawn, his thoughts no longer hidden behind the walls of his professionalism. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her hand steady and sure, as though nothing at all had happened. "Houses remember," she said softly, almost to herself. "People think they can bury their pasts beneath fresh coats of paint and polished floors. But walls listen, floors whisper. And eventually, the house speaks." Justice, Miss Marple had always believed, was not just the domain of punishment. Sometimes, it was simply the truth laid bare, no matter how much it burned. The rain, steady and relentless, beat against the windows, as if the house itself was weeping for the sins it had witnessed. Miss Marple rose from her chair, smoothing the folds of her skirt, her movements slow and deliberate. The truth had been uncovered, not through violence or force, but through patience, through the quiet persistence of reality. And as the residents of Blackwood Hall sat in stunned silence, Miss Marple's eyes flickered briefly to the door, the unspoken weight of her presence lingering in the room. The housemaid was the first to move, her hands shaking as she adjusted the cushions on the chair, a futile attempt to restore order to the chaos within her mind. The solicitor remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the empty hearth, as if expecting the flames to give him answers. Lady Clara, her face a mask of composure, sat stiffly in her chair, her fingers curled tightly around the armrest. But she was not at peace, none of them were. The truth, though not loud or violent, had shattered the fragile glass that had once separated appearance from reality. And now, as the storm outside continued to rage, Blackwood Hall stood on the precipice. The walls, now awakened, had spoken their truth, and it was only a matter of time before the consequences would follow. The drawing-room emptied slowly, each step a reflection of the weight that had been lifted from their shoulders, but also of the burden that now hung over them, invisible, suffocating. No one spoke, no one dared. Miss Marple's words had done the unthinkable. They had cracked open the facade that had shielded Blackwood Hall from its past. It was no longer a house of elegance and propriety. It was a house of secrets, and those secrets had found their way into the light. As Lady Clara withdrew to her room, closing the door softly behind her, Miss Marple remained in the drawing-room, her knitting needles moving with practiced ease. There was nothing more to say. Blackwood Hall had been exposed, and its inhabitants, those who had lived in the shadow of their lies, could now see their house and their lives for what they truly were. A house may forget its silver, but it never forgets the hands that took it. And those hands, Miss Marple knew, would never be able to wash the stains away. In the stillness of the drawing-room, Lady Clara stood, her reflection fractured not in glass, but in the fragmented truths she had long avoided. The weight of years spent burying secrets beneath layers of silk and stone bore down on her, suffocating in its quiet persistence. She hadn't wanted to know, not truly, not the full extent of the betrayal that had been quietly simmering in Blackwood Hall. The theft of silver, a matter dismissed as a petty indulgence, had been but a ripple in a tide of darker truths, each one circling ever closer to the heart of the house. Harrove had known, he had known too much, and yet she had allowed it to fester, allowing his silence to be purchased in favor of her peace. But silence, she had learned, was never peace. It was an echo, a lingering presence that gnawed at the edges of a home, wearing down the foundation until it cracked under its own weight. The night of Harrove's death had not been the fault of panic alone, nor of the housemaid who had been pushed too far. It had been the fault of everyone who had chosen to look away when the cracks first appeared. Miss Marple's voice, so calm and assured, had pierced the tension like a needle through fabric, unraveling the lies and exposing the suffocating truths buried beneath years of careful control. As the old detective spoke of debts paid not with money, but with blood, of a house haunted not by ghosts, but by its own rotten core, Lady Clara could no longer deny the truth. She had been complicit, not just in the theft, but in everything that had followed. The housemaid, her hands trembling as she packed her few belongings, had not meant to kill Harrove, but in a house like Blackwood Hall, even unintentional actions could not escape the weight of history. She had been loyal, yes, but loyalty had a cost. And now, as she walked silently down the hall, her eyes downcast and her future uncertain, the house itself seemed to whisper in a language only those who had been inside long enough could understand. Secrets, once hidden, had a way of becoming all-consuming. The solicitor too sat at his desk, a man paralyzed by the very silence he had spent his career cultivating. His thoughts, once sharp and precise, now felt like rusted blades, useless and dull. His reputation, built on the careful management of others' sins, would crumble as silently as it had been constructed, crushed under the weight of his own complicity. The letters he would write, the explanations he would attempt, were nothing more than a final attempt to dress a wound that had long since festered beyond repair. And yet, in the end, there would be no dramatic downfall, no public spectacle. His ruin would come quietly, an absence that would replace his name in conversations as swiftly as the fog rolling in at dawn. The truth, like the slow turning of a tide, had come in and swept everything clean, everything but the house, which remembered everything. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she did so with a quiet nod, the weight of her words hanging in the air, like the last vestiges of a storm, leaving only a fragile stillness behind. The residents of Blackwood Hall, their faces pale with the realization of what they had allowed to unfold, could do nothing but watch her leave. There were no tearful apologies, no words of remorse. The house, in all its grandeur, had been exposed in its most vulnerable form, and its inhabitants were left to reckon with the truth they had long avoided. In the end, it was not the silver that had been stolen, nor the secrets that had been hidden, but the very soul of the house itself that had been taken, consumed by the weight of its own dark past. Miss Marple's departure from Blackwood Hall was nothing like a grand conclusion. It was the quiet exit of someone who had not come to conquer or to judge, but simply to listen, to unravel, and to watch the truth, long buried beneath layers of silence, find its voice. As her carriage rolled away from the estate, not a trace of triumph lingered in her heart. She had not come for victory. She had come because, like the house itself, she knew the weight of silence was never truly lifted, until it was allowed to speak. The house would endure, of that she was certain. For in the end, houses like Blackwood Hall, ancient, weathered, and full of untold stories, did not belong to those who inhabited them or owned them, they belonged to those who understood them. The servants who polished the silver, stoked the fires, and carried the burdens of the past through every whisper and every glance. It was the silent language of the house that spoke the loudest, a language Miss Marple had spent a lifetime learning. She knew this truth: while families might crumble, fortunes might vanish, the house remained, a silent observer, witnessing everything. But now, as she looked back at the fading silhouette of Blackwood Hall, there was no feeling of triumph. The walls, once so full of secrets, now knew they had been heard. The silence had been broken, and its weight, carried for so long, could never be restored to the way it once was. Yet what Miss Marple had revealed was not just a tale of crime and consequence, but a reflection on the price of silence itself. The true cost of secrets wasn't in the stolen silver, or the tragic demise of Harrove. It lay in the lingering silence that had allowed the house's darkest truths to grow into ghosts, haunting its halls and binding its inhabitants to a past they dared not confront. In the end, Miss Marple didn't just solve a mystery, she exposed a house laden with unresolved ghosts, each one still very much alive, trapped by their own fears. And now, the question lingered, like a shadow stretching long into the night: If you lived in a house like Blackwood Hall, surrounded by whispers, secrets, and debts never spoken, would you remain silent, choosing the safety of shadows, or would you dare to speak the truth, knowing the price it might cost you? Would you be like Harrowf, loyal but ultimately crushed by your silence, or like Lady Clara, trying to pretend the weight of it could be erased by avoidance? The mystery didn't just end with Miss Marple's departure, it lingered in the silence that followed, forcing all who had been touched by it to reckon with their own choices, their own complicity, and their own truths. For in a house where every creak in the floorboards whispered a secret, and every shadow held a memory, the real story had only just begun, one that would echo through the halls, long after the last guest had left, long after the final curtain fell. Would you dare uncover the truth, or remain a prisoner of the silence? The secrets of Blackwood Hall may have been unearthed, but the real question remains: how many others are still buried beneath the surface, waiting for the courage to be spoken aloud?